This episode is brought to you by the MJ family of companies. Whatever interests you in the cannabis community can be found at mj.com. Unique and original content updating you on the latest trends in marijuana legalization, businesses and executives that are disrupting the industry, along with recreational entertainment and the latest deals on the brands and products you love. Visit mj.com today. Welcome to the Pot Live Podcast. I'm your host, Lenny G, and I can't believe it. We've already broken through 100 episodes. We want to thank you, the listeners, thousands of you that have sent beautiful comments, beautiful notes to us. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoy it. This next year, we're going to bring you the thought leaders, entertainers, trailblazers, CEOs of all the cannabis companies you want to hear from. People that are inventing new products, people that are bringing this cannabis industry to the mainstream. We are going to offer you education, value, and entertainment. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. And we are back. Another episode of the Pot Live Podcast. I'm your host, Lenny G. And today we have a very special guest, Mr. Tim Seymour. He is the founder and chief investment officer of Seymour Asset Management. They provide asset management and wealth management services to all their clients. He is also the portfolio manager of the Amplify Seymour Cannabis ETF. Ticker is CNBS. Gotten to know him over the last few months. Mr. Tim Seymour, welcome to the show.
Lenny G, great to be here on the show. Really a
excellent.
Pleasure.
Great to have you. Great to have you. A lot of us watch you on CNBC's Fast Money, and great to have you on the show. So for those of our listeners who don't know you, and Tim, just so you know, we have a mix of business owners. We have a mix of recreational cannabis users. We have medical users, professionals, everything across the spectrum here that listen to the show. So for those that may not know you, how about a little background on who Tim Seymour is?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to be at mj.com. Clearly a place I'm sure people are reaching to all the time to get their news flow and get some insights. And, you know, my background in cannabis started probably about 6 years ago. And I like to point out that my background in cannabis feels, you know, very similar to, you know, having a background in emerging markets, which is where I spent the first 20 plus years of my career, focused on these emerging economies and these really exciting consumption stories that were also, you know, ultimately though, very much bottom up, you know, stock picking and high growth consumer product stories, which I think is exactly what we're talking about in cannabis. But look, I started investing as I recognized the legislative, both, you know, evolution, agenda, outlook, and clearly if in 2015, 2016, there were definitely a lot of questions about if. Now it's not about if. It's not even really about when. It's more about how much. But I started both investing in the private markets. You know, my background's in public hedge fund, long short equity. I started getting involved in the sector as both an advisor and, you know, from a capital markets perspective, working with a bunch of companies as I started talking about cannabis on CNBC. And my argument then, as it is today, is that a lot of investors need to really understand that this is not just a, you know, call it a euphoric run into an asset class that's going to come and go. This isn't really about necessarily descheduling and the just the medical cannabis markets or the adult cannabis markets. This is lifestyle. This is social evolution. This is so many things. And that was the conversation I started to have. And so because of that, I found myself becoming kind of an industry insider and having relationships with all the big CEOs. And then ultimately, you know, we launched the ETF because my view was investors need an active, you know, call it ETF product that's, you know, clearly intended to give exposure to this exciting thematic, you know, sector play, but one that really is in touch with the, you know, merger activity. I can participate when I actually think, you know, things like the Reddit rebellion start to take over a sector. And we arguably had plenty of that momentum in mid-February near the peak of the markets in cannabis. And you know, sometimes being active means you see a stock moving 40% and it doesn't, you're happy to own it before that day, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the fundamentals got any better. And so sometimes you can be a little bit more tactical rather than having a 3-month, 6-month, rebalancing schedule that's really more formulaic and robotic. So yeah, I mean, I think my reason for wanting to build this ETF was that I have a background in these types of asset classes. I have a background that also, understands some of the capital markets dynamics, including the ones we know about in cannabis, where U.S. companies have to go to Canada and Canadian companies have to come here. And so that sometimes your best investments are ones that are kind of in touch with where capital will flow, not always necessarily the cheapest company, the best upside growth. It's sometimes, active management is just trying to understand the market dynamics itself. So we launched CNBS. It's been a really exciting period. It's been a real exciting 12 months as the U.S. is re-rated and as we've seen a broadening of the market. And most importantly for investors, we've seen real profitability. And I think CNBS is very much exposed to that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're happy about the performance. I would always urge investors, take a look at how your ETFs and mutual funds or what other fund vehicles you're investing in, how are they doing relative to their peer group? How are they doing relative to the asset class? And I think that's ultimately the standard we hold ourselves to at CNBS. So I'm involved on the hedge fund side too. I work with the largest hedge fund in the space at JW Asset Management, and we're very active in the private markets and also the public markets. So it's busy times here in Cannabis Land, and I think that's exciting. At times it's been a little frenetic. I know investors at times have had a lot of anxiety about feeling like the trade was moving too quickly, and I would just reiterate that we are still very early innings. I think there are companies that have carved out a really nice moat for their businesses, but I think there's obviously going to be many new players that emerge here that may not be folks that are anywhere on the radar right now.
So for the different level of investor out there that may be listening, whether it's a small investor, mid-size, or large investor, would you say that the proper outlook for them is don't worry about the daily stock price right now because there's going to be these momentum swings here and there in this new industry, but it's a long-term hold, and don't worry about looking at your portfolio value every single day because it'll drive you crazy? Would that be good advice?
Well, for sure, investors need to understand there's volatility inherent in these markets, and it was nice looking at your portfolio in mid-February when we'd seen a lot of these stocks up. First of all, look at the year over year, just a rolling 1-year performance in the industry to today, where we've even had a major pullback in the last 6 to 7 weeks. But a Terrscend is up 340% on a rolling 1-year basis. Aphria is up 305%. Trulieve 245%. So looking at your portfolio, I mean, largely you should still even be bringing a smile to your face even after a big pullback. But yeah, I would say cannabis is an asset class that's going to continue to evolve, become more sophisticated. You've probably heard people refer to it as ultimately a CPG, a consumer packaged goods story. We think that is very much the case. And so I think the key is to really feel as if you own companies that are relevant and important and profitable today, and ones that will be there tomorrow and evolving with the sector, or investing thematically in a vehicle that gives you that exposure. So, I think it's exciting to be investing in cannabis because the growth is so high, because the country and the world are changing so quickly, and cannabis is developing as a call it a consumption story at a time that other more established industry sectors are also evolving very quickly. I mean, think of where e-commerce is and what that's done to shape how we consume, but our purchasing habits in anything from consumer staples to highly discretionary goods. And think about logistics and ERP and software and big data and AI. So all of these things that people, investors know are going on in some of the other sectors they invest in and have been a big part of the performance of a lot of the companies there. Just know that those trends and those themes are alive in your cannabis portfolio as well. So I think, yeah, you're right, though. I mean, I think investors need to, I think playing long term here is the right way to approach it. I think there's been an opportunity to be a trader and an investor, as we like to phrase this. But ultimately, I think investors should be thinking about a medium to long term outlook.
And what are, obviously with the change in the White House, we're recording this in the spring of 2021. The new administration seems to be more cannabis friendly. What are the upcoming catalysts or bills that may be passed where people can start looking for that might spur on the cannabis stock market?
Right. So the legislative calendar that has been absolutely a catalyst and a driver to performance, I think let's at least look at the most recent timeline and the November elections. Investors may remember, we all know what happened in Washington. Well, from the perspective of state ballots that were coincident that night, going on election night, you had basically 5 new states come online. 3 of them that were highly, call them conservative, somewhat unexpected, if not very unexpected. So the evolution of the cannabis legislation, just in terms of the state ballots, and reminding people that at this point, we are now 18 states have an adult market plus DC. 75% of the country effectively lives in some type of legal cannabis environment. But that the Georgia runoff in early January, that was to decide really the direction and the call it the political orientation, the majority of the Senate. It turned the Senate blue, and it doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on. From a cannabis perspective, and what this meant was there was an opportunity to now really see legislation go through that would begin to address, I think, some of the things that will help the sector re-rate, because again, what's been going on state by state around the country, and this has been going on for the last 4 or 5 years and goes all the way back to the Colorados in 2013, and is like the states are continuing to do what they do. The public is voting, and they're voting locally, and they're being recognized, and this industry is growing anyway. But to the extent that legislation comes from Washington that will then allow the industry first to have banking, to have acceptance, and to not be seen as in violation of AML, anti-money laundering, and some of this basic banking dynamics and money flow dynamics is very important. Then you get into just commercial banking and efficiencies, and then cost of capital. Ultimately, the legislation that investors should be watching is the legislation that is going to allow cannabis to be investable by some of the biggest institutions in the world. Because if you're a state pension fund or an endowment or a very, very large pool of institutional capital, you're not able to invest in the part of the cannabis market that's probably the highest growth. You're able to, in some cases, invest in the ancillary markets. In some cases, they're able to invest, north of the border or other parts of the world. But U.S. institutional capital is still on the outside, watching legislation that changes that. And so there's different pieces of legislation that include, yes, descheduling. So cannabis is a Schedule I drug in this country still, and it's been that way since the 70s. And therefore, there's so many dynamics because of that classification, which also just include IRS tax treatment for companies and their accounting, and it makes it very punitive and almost impossible especially for retail-oriented companies to even use normal accounting methods to do an income statement. Basically, you can't deduct cost of goods sold. You can't do basic things that would allow a company to be profitable. So these are the things investors should be watching for in the short term, and I mean 3 to 6 months, because of the Senate majority now being led by Chuck Schumer, who's been very vocal in favor of cannabis legalization. There's a high expectation that we're beginning to get the legislation. The question is the complexity of the legislation. Believe it or not, I think the banking stuff is a lot easier to get through than the legislation that starts to begin and deal with the criminal justice dynamics of what happens to criminal records and folks still in jail, and the complexity of those dynamics, social justice, and then social equity, especially because of where the war on drugs has disproportionately affected minority segments of this country and probably the world, but I'll speak about the U.S. These are the things that the legislation is paying attention to and trying to get it right. And but for investors, make no mistake, the November elections and then the Georgia runoff changed what was still already growing sentiment in the last administration's Congress and White House. Cannabis was moving anyway. It's now been fast tracked, and the final element of this is there's no question that legislators in every state of the country and those in D.C. understand the potential fiscal benefit from legalizing, from taxing, and actually bringing this into the legal markets what was existing in the black markets. There's no question this market exists. And that's one of the great things about the cannabis market. And for people that are speculating on the size, and this isn't about an industry that needs to grow. This is already a massive industry, and it's just about bringing it under the tent.
Yep. So we took a few listener questions because I told a few mastermind groups I'm a part of that you were coming on. Exciting. And of course, everyone wants stock picks. So give us core holdings in the cannabis industry. What type of stock should an investor have as a couple of core holdings in their portfolio? In your opinion?
Sure. So again, on the ETF side, we have a handful of names in there that we think are kind of anchor holdings, and they're anchor holdings whether you're investing in the U.S. or whether you're investing in Canada or whether you're investing globally. Those are looking here at the top of the balance sheet. So we have Silver Spike, which is the SPAC that essentially is doing the Weed Maps deal. And again, whether this is the Yelp or the DoorDash of cannabis, this is an e-commerce, but a software story, and really a place where I think we have exposure to one of the first real kind of exciting both e-commerce and software plays within cannabis. We own Hydrofarm, which is a big hydroponics retailer. Remember, the story in the cannabis world and what's going on the cultivation side is also going on in parallel with a bigger trend around food safety, organics, hydroponics. So again, this is a play that we think as a company that can re-rate outside of just the cannabis industry. It's great exposure to, call it, specialty retail, and we continue to believe that that's how people want to have some exposure. We have a couple REIT holdings, and again, if you think about the capital markets that are constrained by some of the federal dynamics, owning companies like AFC Gamma, which is an IPO we participated in about 7 weeks ago. This is, to us, one of the more interesting REIT plays you can have in cannabis. It's exposed to companies that we actually know the underlying creditor, and therefore we've been able to kind of do our work understanding the loan portfolio book that's part of the REIT, and so having REIT exposure, because these are very, very interesting yield plays in the sector. And
IIPR, which one was that?
Yeah, that's AFC Gamma, AFCG, but also IIPR. Yeah, for sure. Okay. This is another name. The one of the exciting things that we're happy to say at CNBS is that we got approved to invest directly touching the plant last week. So we announced that actually on 4/20, that we're now able to own names like GreenThumb and Curaleaf and Cresco Labs and Terrscend and Trulieve. So as I speak about those names, look, those are probably right there. Those are the big five, call them the big five U.S. multi-state operators. And I think each have compelling arguments in favor for owning them. They are the largest players. In some cases, they're a Curaleaf who's in 23 states and has a national footprint and has built brands both in wellness and also in THC. And I think is very, very ambitious in terms of their growth path, both here and abroad. You have a Trulieve, which is really the dominant player in Florida. They also have exposure in a handful of other states, but they're a case of an operator that went very deep and very narrow in one of the most important cannabis states, is maybe the most profitable and free cash flow generative company in the industry, and is now expanding outside of Florida aggressively and strategically. Someone like a Terrscend, who might have the highest margin business of any of the multi-state operators, especially based upon the profitability of what's going on in Pennsylvania, where they are the largest player there. They're also now one of just a handful of license holders in the newly emerged New Jersey adult market. So there's a case of someone that's not narrow in one state. They're really positioned, called in 3 states. And
doesn't Canopy have an option to buy Terrscend as well, or some sort of partnership with them?
So Canopy continues to be adding to a position in Terrscend, yeah, and Canopy, I think at this point is in the low 20% area of in the 20s on their ownership of Terrscend. And look, Canopy Growth, which is a large position in the portfolio as well, and we think is really, despite some of the problems that have gone on up in Canada, has the biggest balance sheet in cannabis, as the biggest strategic, sophisticated Fortune 500 partner in Constellation Brands, who's in the spirits industry been very early in a lot of new marketplaces. And I think their exposure to both Terrscend and Acreage, people know about that big transaction that happened a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. I think Canopy is very well positioned in the U.S. And meanwhile, they're the ones that immediately come with distribution and branding and kind of that marketing powerhouse that if this industry is where people think it's going to go, Canopy Growth is going to be there. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's good exposure to Terrscend there.
Great. Before we finish up, Tim, just tell everyone, how can they learn more about your ETF or follow you or your team either on social or online?
Yeah, thanks. So look, Amplify Seymour Cannabis ETF, ticker CNBS, is the ETF. You can go to the Amplify site. We do a weekly recap where I spend 8 or 9 minutes quickly going through both the market, the macro, and then the portfolio. And I believe it's a great weekly just update on the industry, frankly. And so I think you can buy CNBS on your Schwab account or your E-Trade account or your Fidelity account or whatever your account is, or talk to your investment advisor about it. If there's interest in understanding more about the hedge fund and investing in both cannabis private equity, you go to SeymourAM.com, Seymour Asset Management. So SeymourAM.com. And there's a place to leave information, and one of our representatives will get back to you. And obviously, if you're interested in broader wealth management services, we'd love to talk to you about that as well. So yeah, exciting times and great to be here on MJ.com and telling the story. And we look forward to coming back.
Excellent. Tim Seymour, founding partner of Seymour Asset Management, portfolio manager of CNBS, the ETF. Thank you so much for being a guest today, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Lenny G. Great to be here.
All right. And we'll see everyone next time on the Pot Live podcast. If you are into the recreational side of the cannabis industry, yes, stoners, I'm talking to you, then thepot.com is the online and mobile destination for you. That's right, THEPOT.com, thepot.com. Where else can you find the exclusive Pot Mate of the Month? Take a pot quiz and win prizes. Scroll through hilarious memes and jokes and check out the latest podcasts, news, and trends, all while having your own profile and voice in the pot.com forum. Visit thepot.com today and get lit.